Hello, and welcome to the second webinar in the series of workshops as well, where I'm going to be deconstructing Industry 4.0 and rebuilding it essentially. Now, last time, for those of you who haven't watched it yet, we covered basically terminology. Now, this is super important because quite often people can have the same conversations about different things. I also feel that Industry 4.0 has lost its way. I think the whole ecosystem, if you like, is very high level and people are latching on to different bits and the marketing's gotten out of control. There's not enough that's been defined. And I find this incredibly frustrating when you consider the importance of improving the efficiencies of manufacturing, the sustainability, the profitability, basically. And especially with things like globalization crashing and China potentially crashing. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that today, about the why we want to be doing all this. And I think it's incredibly important. And I think if we're not defining what it is we're all talking about, we're never going to get to a solution, okay? So this is really the aim in today's webinar, is to get into a bit more detail about the why. Now, I will touch on a few more details of what I talked about in the first webinar, where we talk about digitization, digital transformation, and adaptive manufacturing. Now, I've chosen adaptive manufacturing deliberately because I want a sort of clean sheet. And I think also it could be possible that Industry 4.0 is trying to be all things to all men. And if you look down here in the lower left-hand corner, if I can get out of the way a minute, you'll see why this might be. Just excuse me while I move this. Now, this is where I think there's a little bit of confusion. Now, there's lots of different ways where we can split what is an industry, what is manufacturing, what the tiers or the levels, if you like, of industry are. So maybe Industry 4.0 is trying to be, like I said, all things to all people. Now, this is a extract that I've pulled off the International Labour Organization, which actually has got quite a good amount of detail on this stuff. There's two tiers, or primary, three that are the main ones for what I would classify as industries: the primary, secondary, and then essentially the services. Now, in primary, they class that as mining and oil and gas and things like that. But I think there's a bit of a blurred line with what manufacturing is. But what it does say is that manufacturing is about 55% of industry in general. It actually says it's the most popular, which is interesting. So you can see this here in front of you, and I might move it over a little bit for you. And this is where I think there's a bit of a disconnect. Now, on the first in the series, the last one I did, we touched on what I could find, the best thing I could find to an executive summary, basically. And we went through those points individually to actually try and separate the wheat from the chaff, if you like. And this is, interestingly, so also on the website of Industry 4.0, there is this, which is the 2030 vision. And you can look at this yourself. I'm not going to go into detail. You can read as well as I can. But I've read it several times, and I do struggle to extract useful information out for manufacturing. Of course, it talks about digital infrastructure, it talks about technology, it talks about security. I mean, it talks about sustainability, which is good. Circular economy, I think, is a limited approach. I think sustainability covers such a broad range of things. So sustainability covers business, covers transportation, it covers everything, you know. So I think, you know, the business practices need to be sustainable. And this is, you know, this is one of the problems which I'll touch on, which is globalization. It was an easy win for a few. I think the world is starting to realize that it can't carry on. It's non-sustainable. So I'm not saying globalization is going away. Okay, I'm not going to get too deep into politics. I think it had the right idea. You know, with trade, open trade, and a free market. But I think at the end of the day, it wasn't sustainable. So, you know, am I surprised that globalization is crashing? No, I'm absolutely not. And to be honest, I think it needs a reset. I'm not saying it's going away. So another thing that's cropped up a few times is two things really. So first of all, where does it all end? Which is quite an understandable question. And the other thing is, how applicable is it to my sector or my industry? Well, you know, these are good questions, and this is part of the reason why I think there's a fair bit of confusion, because Industry 4.0 is talking about the whole ecosystem, even though some of the details are quite clearly aimed at manufacturing. So what I'm going to do now is just sort of pull that apart a little bit. And basically, out of all this list, I'm not saying it's exhaustive. I can take out some of the areas which, you know, aren't so relevant. So education as well. So you can see there's a lot of industries, there's a lot of sectors that these sort of tools are applicable for. And really, so any asset that is either being controlled or monitored, that's applicable, especially when we're talking about modularity. So, and the life cycle, you know, the data of the assets and the data of any peripheral products and services, etc. So it is, you know, incredibly applicable to many other sectors, but it's also broad in its scope, if you know what I mean. So key really is, you know, the structure of the assets, and then really we're talking about the supply chain, etc. So, but a lot of the technology is already available. If I zoom out quickly and come across, we can see there that's, you know, a very, very high level. This bit here is a very, very high level Industry 4.0 statement. They've got sort of specialist areas that they're working on. But if we come over here, you can see that we do talk about the adaptive factory, value networks. Well, you know, it's basically just a new beginning for how we treat our supply chain. There are already many, many supply chains out there, some very complex products being made that wouldn't be possible without, you know, digital transformation, without a direct connection of the whole supply chain, essentially. So, you know, I think we do need to be clear about when we're talking about manufacturing and the digital economy in general. I think it can get a bit diluted and a bit vague. Talk a little bit about today's agenda. I'm moving around a bit. As you know, last time I said, because things are so interconnected, it's quite hard to stay on topic. But I'm going to talk more about why it matters, okay, today. You can see here in the top left. And how important the business plan for these kind of, so some are projects, some is more of a business philosophy, strategy, vision, if you like. You know, they're not just discrete projects, so they're interconnected again. And then we'll talk a little bit about how, okay? So if I move over, so this is an important part of what I'm sort of calling a new model. I'm not going to be too dramatic about it, me creating a new model. But what I want to do is to show you a slightly bigger view. So this is really me deconstructing Industry 4.0. Okay, so we've got the digital twin, which, like I said before, straddles adaptive manufacturing and logistics, and I deliberately lump those two together. Digital transformation is essential, and there's a good reason for that. And then sustainability, which is also essential. Otherwise, it's not going to survive. Okay, so the implications are huge. The implications are very much part of the business plan for any of these endeavors, company step changes in company practice, etc. But so here, really, I'm going to be talking about the why, and all of these are non-negotiable. Okay. So limited resources. So that I do I need to spell it out maybe, but there are limited resource, hence the circular economy. We need to bear that in mind at all stages of benefits to the business and humanity. The global demographics, and this is an interesting one. I've watched quite a few videos by Peter Zine. He is a does a lot of webinars on geopolitics, incredibly interesting, his insights. So global demographic changes, this is what I was talking about, okay, the rebalance or even end of globalization. Generation changes, okay, so there's the different generations have slightly different perspectives. Global skill shortage, now this is a huge one for manufacturers, on engineering and on manufacturing site staff, basically. So all this feeds into everything else, okay, so this is why there's a huge discussion about AI, absolutely. But I think there's also implications for skills reallocation, okay, and retraining, because we're not going to need less people. There's going to be less people out there, but people talk about losing jobs. But to be honest, I can't see any situation where there'll be longer term, mid-long term, where there's going to be a real shortage of work. Okay, it's really about the supply balancing demand, not really an overall deficit. So the one of the most important, I can say, maybe if not the most immediate importance, is the adaptive and secure supply chain. So this is leading into Industry 4.0 as well, where we have this secure supply chain. The pandemic showed us how vulnerable we were, and has driven a little bit of this so-called onshoring, and it's natural. I think globalization will rebalance, but we do need to take a good hard look, I think, at the risks that we face in our supply chains and who we rely on, and how we work with them in a collaborative way, rather than the traditional supplier-purchaser kind of arrangement. So if I come down a little bit, we can see here that, as I said, we've got a real need now to address this. So if I come down, you can see here the declining working age populations, okay? This is, again, covered quite well by Peter Zine, and it's quite shocking, really. I mean, Japan there seems to be the worst, and China's quite dramatic. So on top of other problems within China, I think, there's going to be some real problems ahead. I'm not saying nobody realizes this. This is just one example here, down here on the bottom left. This is the UK government where I live, with all their faults. They do seem to be getting a grip on manufacturing, digital technologies, rather than just relying on services, which seems to be, or for many years, seemed to be their main focus. So manufacturing, if you consider it's 55% of all industry, needs to have a bit of a reset. All right, there's lots of other resets, I think, that we need in this world, but manufacturing is definitely one of them. And I think there's an issue with language. As I said before, things get lost in translation. So this is really, when I come back here, you can see what I think is a disconnect between, this is the expanded bit of the Industry 4.0 2030 vision, okay? There's a lot of words in there. Some of it is useful and kind of makes sense. Some of it, I can't really make sense of it at all. But overall, it's good to have at least some vision, and strategy. But again, vision, strategy, and then the shop floor. It's not always a top down. So a couple of companies such as 4.0 Solutions, which I'll mention again in a minute, quite rightly put an emphasis on actually bottom up approach. And there's a good reason for this, because we are trying to solve the problems on the ground, right? Of course you need vision, of course you need strategy, but this is where we need the joined up approach to tackle some of these issues. So if I touch on just quickly, if I touch on digital transformation, okay, is one example. There's lots of topics here, as you can see. But digital transformation, this is a good post from a few months ago. I can't remember exactly when, but Walker Reynolds and the guys at 4.0 Solutions are doing some really fantastic work, sorting out the chaff from the wheat and doing things like prove it, taking products and actually testing them. And this is a repost from Walker from a guy called Jeff Winter. Never met Jeff. But if you look here, you can read for yourself how much of a disconnect there is between the actual understanding on the ground, on the shop floor, if you like, of what these things actually mean to and not just on the shop floor, sorry, but on in the boardroom as well. What these things actually mean and what the implications are for the assets, the company, the business. So this is an excellent definition, so this really expands on this 4.0 level of descriptions, process transformation, business model transformation, cultural, that's a huge thing, culture, ecosystem transformation. This is, the partnerships, the collaboration, the remodel really of the supply chain and the way we work together, okay? We basically have all the tools to make this happen, but we haven't quite made this transition from the old methods, if you like, in the 90s and the noughties through to really what challenges we face now. So if I zoom out again, and maybe I'll drop back onto this, okay, digital transformation is a huge thing. So I'm going to scoot into quickly, because of the why, I'm not just doing this, like I said before, I always have a reason for this. So if we look at the business case, okay, and I do a few of these, get the ball started for people sometimes with the business case, the justifications, and the how linked to the why directly. So this is going back to sort of user requirements, specifications, and the benefits to the business, okay? So as I said before, we absolutely need new finance tools. I've lost count of the number of projects that just haven't been calculated in totally in the wrong way. So traditionally, of course, it's return on investment. I said that last time in the first video. It's very outdated. Of course, it's still relevant in some cases. It's absolutely not relevant for adaptive manufacturing, Industry 4.0. We need new finance tools, and basically the one that's moving along more quickly, if you like, is total cost of ownership. So that's been around for a few years. It really talks about the overall cost of an asset over its entire life cycle, from its development and design all the way through to its decommissioning. Great. But there was never anything to counterbalance that, right? There was never a total benefit of ownership, okay? So we've got our costs, which is the lower part of the scale, but we've also got our benefits, okay? So unless we're really honestly calculating the benefits of a particular asset, we can't make the right decisions. And when you sum those positive and negatives together over its entire lifetime, you'll get what we call TVO, which is a total value of ownership. Now, this is something I've created, not because I'm a genius. It's because it totally makes sense. Okay, you've got the total cost of ownership, which is showing you how much it costs you, and then over the time series you've got the benefits. Okay, and you need a clear picture of, some of these assets we'll be using for 10, 20, 30 years, or should be. Some of these assets are going to be, used for short-term development, things like that. They'll be superseded, etc., etc. So what we want to do is we want an honest awareness of the total lifespan of these assets. So this is a topic in its own right for sure, which I will go into. All right. And I do apologize for hopping around. I know I'm hopping around a little bit, but to be honest, like I said before, it's not scripted. And there's good reason for that, because I think it would take me too long to script it. But let's pull apart a little bit more on the how. I'm going to touch on, which you can see up there in the top left-hand corner, on management, leadership, vision, strategy. I just want to quickly touch on this because I know a lot of you will be interested to expand a little bit on this. So I'm not going to explain all this again. This is what I'm lumping together to describe overall as adaptive manufacturing. And it really is talking about, if I start at the top, really is talking about true modularity, not modularity if you spend 3 days integrating a segment of a machine, line or cell. What is incredibly important, and I will be talking a lot about, is how to decouple the processes of manufacturing in order to make them more modular, more adaptive, but also more resilient to downtime, changes in production schedules, more customization and things like that. And it also ties in with logistics. Now, connectivity architecture and data structure, which you can see down here, they're highlighted slightly differently. And there's a reason for that, because once you decide on this sort of philosophy, it's very hard to change, if not impossible. Well, not impossible, but it will be expensive to change. So if you get your connectivity architecture and your data structure, or your contextualized data strategy in place, everything else will become much, much more easy. Now, when we talk about connectivity architecture, there is one thing to remember. So the first thing down here is there's synchronous and there's non-synchronous data. This is where I do a lot of work in where we need to have synchronous data, timestamps, and when we don't, and how we join those together afterwards. That's super important. And this is again a term coined from Walker Reynolds at 4.0 Solutions. So he sums it up quite nicely: connect, collect, store, visualize, and analyze. Now, there's never been a truer phrase. That's basically what we have to do in digital transformation. So that I've put those together because that covers existing assets and what some people call greenfield assets. Now, before I go too much further, what I think we need to move away from in these type of discussions is to move away from discussing brown and greenfield sites. And the reason is adaptive manufacturing can bridge this. Okay, so you can still have new state-of-the-art assets easily integrated into your brownfield sites. It doesn't require any barriers, if you like. It doesn't present any barriers or any significant barriers to do this. But I do appreciate why we talk about it in some senses, because if I zoom out a bit, for a digital transformation and adaptive manufacturing point of view, we're still talking about the data map being the same, but the tasks that the manufacturer has to do are slightly different. So with existing assets, a huge amount of time is spent assigning variables, linking variables to data points for this connect, collect, store visualize and analyze. So we need that auto discovery. We need that population, the auto population. Now, today I'm not going to go into MQTT and OPC UA, but what I will say is for cellular manufacturing and adaptive manufacturing, you need the publish and subscribe model, not the server client. So the server client model had its day, it still has its place, but overall, when you're disconnecting assets, and you have a data structure, a map, as I like to call it, and again, I'm not going to go into detail today. Walker Reynolds 4.0 team have done a great job looking at all this, but what I will say is that when you start introducing new assets, it should just plug in. And there's absolutely no reason why it can't plug in, and there's absolutely no reason why we can't change the modules within these assets. So, there is, however, some considerations with adaptive manufacturing and the transportation systems which enable this. And again, this is why I was talking about I've been involved a lot with intelligent transportation systems. This is another reason, actually, interestingly, this is why the auto industry has been ahead of the game, because they have had a lot of financial stresses, still have lots of financial stresses, but they still need to have a very fast turnaround of different types of products. The variety of products is unimaginable. You can't imagine, and they've actually started limiting those. But when you have those problems, you actually come back to this smart transportation system. Now, it might be a conveyor belt, it might be a hook crane system, it could be anything, but nonetheless, and we have different types, that's absolutely fine. But it comes back to the first rule of automation, the absolute undeniable first rule of automation, and that is control the product. Once you let go of the product, you've got to spend money getting control of the product again. This is absolutely the first rule of automation. And there's some considerations here, and I'm not going to go into that today. What I'm going to do now, I think, is just summarize a little bit on this brownfield and greenfield scenario. Okay, so I've had a lot of people where they say, well, we can't do that, that's a brownfield site, can't do that. There's absolutely no reason why you can't install an adaptive manufacturing cell, for example, decoupled with proper planning and the right skill sets to make it happen. And the benefits will appear very, very quickly. Okay, so when we talk about total cost of ownership, total benefit of ownership, you actually kind of plan in, you know ahead of time what those benefits are going to be. So if I asked you to put a value on the older term, so flexibility, and actually there was a few bloopers in my previous video for those of you who spotted it, my overuse of the term flexibility. But if I asked you to put a value on flexibility, could you do it? And I think this is an incredibly good question, because you can actually answer it, but it's not a direct question. What you actually say is, what does it cost? What would my factory look like if I could manufacture 20% of my products on these two lines, 30% on these two, and then 50% on these? And then if you actually feed that into an equation of what if I could make half my products on these three lines and half on these three lines, then you could say, what if I could make all my products on all the lines? You actually get quite a good understanding of asset utilization, and that's the bottom line, right? The asset utilization, OE, of course, that's part of it, but asset utilization is a function of change over time, how adaptive it is to new products, how many products you can make on each line. So all that feeds in. And actually it isn't so hard once you have the tools to do it. So coming back around, I'll talk a little bit more about that in the future, but let's talk a little bit about management leadership and strategy. So this is a big problem, and it's not really directed at anybody. I think there isn't really a go-to source of information to help people educate themselves on what it is they actually need to solve or do. And in some large companies, there's a huge problem with this silo mentality. I think human behavior has a tendency to move itself into factions. I did a training course many years ago, when I was 21, I think 22, and we did an exercise in this. It was called Pragmatica. We did an exercise in problem solving, and it was amazing how quickly people go into factions rather than working together. So that's a problem I come up against every day, and so it's good to talk about it. It's good to get it out in the open, but there is a lack of strategy and vision. You can't deny it, and I'm not saying that's anybody's particular fault. We're not saying people are stupid. It's just we're in a new world, and to try and join the dots again. This is why I'm doing this whole series of webinars and workshops. Eventually, I'm looking forward to those. Is to help people join the dots. Now, it is time to get real about management, or I prefer leadership. Because yes, of course, assets need managing. I think people who are led don't need managing, right? That's my take on things. But there needs to be more honesty, and we need to define the skills spectrum and what we actually need to make these projects happen. Because having resources is one thing. I would say many of the projects or proof of concepts or step change strategies are under-resourced. But even if they are resourced, we've still got to be honest about what is the skill sets that we need and how those are going to be coordinated. So this is what I'm hoping to achieve with these sets of webinars and workshops. So credit for contribution, honesty, these things are super important. The old school method of management structure sometimes blocking good ideas. I've seen many. I can't tell you, it makes me super angry that we're still doing this. When you look at all the problems that humanity faces, to have the management structure and traits of management, and not leadership, really, I can't tell you how frustrating that is. So I will talk more in the next workshop. I'll go into a bit more detail about the skills spectrum. I probably will go into a little bit more detail on the data side and the connectivity side. I think that's super important. So I'm going to give that the time it deserves. But for today, I've probably run out of a bit of steam. But, we do need to look at our core values. We do need to look at what we're trying to achieve, not just in the short term. One of my pet hates is short-termism. You might have learned that from the first webinar. We need to be thinking longer term. There's no way around it. We need to be thinking more sustainably. We need to be motivating people to get involved, make a difference. Okay, so as I said, all these topics interconnect, so I will wander around more than I should probably. But yes, so today, silo behavior, improving humanity. That's the real reason why. Doing it sustainably and doing it in an adaptive way that we don't scare the finance people. We don't blow it out of the water with costs, right? If we get an honest calculation of the manufacturing assets, how they can work together, how they can be reused, repurposed, is essential for all our futures. So today I'm going to draw a line under that. I'll have a think about the next workshop. Hopefully they'll start to get quicker, take me less time. But hopefully you found that interesting, and I look forward to really looking forward to the workshops in the coming months, probably a month away, I expect. Thanks again. Bye bye.